against that, I'm counterposing angelic internationalism. You know, the force that is strong enough to countermand this nationalist resurgence that's been going on has to be international, and it has to be angelic. And that comes finally to peace. How we can reach the peace that is the wholeness of everything. That's what my work as a philosopher is about. That's why I've written my Peace Magic book, which some of you may know of, and it's the first ever book to look at peace as a magical duty. You know, I watch so many people, you know, talking about magic these days. It's great, but let's apply it to peace. That is, I think, our number one duty as magicians, and to operate at the highest possible level, which is what they were doing in Rome before 1527. It's what Dee was trying to do. You know, it's what all genuine high magicians do, is peace magic. I'm just naming it. And talking of which, I want to mention Asura in the Quran. I'm just about to finish my commentary on the Quran. You know, I've been quite busy over the last 5 years. Since I'm not teaching in a school context as I used to, or lecturing at university, I have a lot of time for detailed scholarship, and I'm doing this huge commentary on the Quran. And that's just epic. I love it to bits. It's awesome, the Quran. And, you know, I could spend my whole lifetime just doing it in detail, but I pretty much done that. I worked on this for 6 years, right? And it's already been published on my Green University website as an audio commentary. If anyone wants to volunteer to type it all up and publish it as a book form, please, you can come and live in France, and, you know, you can work away on that. Or you don't have to, you can do it from home. And you'll go down in history, I assure you. So, I'm working at the moment on Surah 57, which is called Iron, Haddad. And this is a very interesting surah. And as so often with Quranic verses, it has the good news and the bad news. The good news is that if you have faith, if you have belief, if you have applied intelligence, and you're striving in your soul to be righteous, and you identify with all the prophets of all history, the Quran is unbelievably generous about that. It's not like follow my prophet, you know. It's all the prophets of history. And you try and live out the best bit of all their teachings, and you work tirelessly for peace and justice. If you do all that, you're going to have one hell of a time in paradise, guys. You're going to get, like, gardens and sherbet and beautiful it'll be like Renaissance Rome, right? Pre-1527. And for me, it'll be libraries, right? Just, you know, it'll be a garden, fine, but then it's back to the library for me. And for all the scholars of history, we'll all be in the heavenly library, right? And then occasionally we'll go for walks in the garden, like Aristotle used to. But, so that's paradise, that's the good news. The bad news is that if you don't do that, if you mock the teachers and prophets, if you insult them, if you, God forbid, try and kill them and crucify them, if you stick your knee on the living saints on the street, right, and you kill them, if you are rude and violent, and if you're in the mob of Sophiaphobes, and if you burn the libraries and chop up the scholars as they did in that sack in 1527, well, then there's bad news for you guys, because you really are going to get it later. You know, if you manage to escape with, you know, you might think you rule the world now, but, you know, as happened to Hitler or whatever, the evil people fall, and in the afterlife you're going to have to do a reckoning. That's all it's saying. Absolutely straightforward. And I think it's right, you know, as I say in my commentary. I mean, it's as if Mohammed was reading reports of near-death experiences. He's got this eschatological moment of judgment, you know, absolutely clear in his mind. He knows that's what's going to happen. And there's a lot of very interesting research into the origin of Mohammed's own intellectual life story. Nobody's written a really detailed psychohistory of Mohammed yet. transpersonal psychohistory, it would have to be. I mean, there have been anti-Islamic scholars who are trying to demolish the whole thing and say Muhammad was a paedophile, a horrible man, violent, They failed utterly to understand the culture of the time. Muhammad was an Arab, he was from that background, and people used to get married early, there was no shame or crime in any of that then. And they lived much shorter lives. He was of his people, just as all prophets have to be, if they're going to be effective, be of the people they're teaching. But what he did with that energy that he had, they were warriors, these people, pretty fierce, like the Tuaregs still are in North Africa and elsewhere. But he sublimated it to the higher pursuits of wisdom and gnosis. And that's the point I'm bringing out in my commentary on the Quran. And iron, it says, is sent down as the test, along with the book and the balance, very interesting verse, to test men's souls. If we're on the side of justice, we can cope with iron, and it becomes a strength and a backup for us. The sword of peace that I have here is made of steel, that's made of iron. I use it to differentiate magically between right and wrong and truth and lies. And that's iron, that's the strength there. The Celts loved their iron. I mean, we were master swordsmiths way back. Latin culture was mastering iron among the earliest tribes in Europe, and that's why they find all these weapons in lakes and rivers throughout Europe, deposited as offerings by the Celtic warriors at the behest of the Druids, because it's a way the warrior admits, look, I'm not supreme, I'm not the king of the universe, I'm not arrogant. I give my sword back to the goddess, who is the sovereign, mother goddess, the world's soul, if you want. And that's also what the Quran is saying. Same thing. Don't be arrogant, be humble, surrender to God, give your iron back, and only ever use it in a just cause. So, what about 9/11? Was that a just cause? Was that Al-Qaeda and co? Well, some of those elements were caught up in it, I suspect. Elements of Islamic terrorism had been hoodwinked into thinking, hey, this is cool, we're going to be part of a plot to blow up, New York. But obviously there were others operating, and there were plots within plots within plots, and I've tried to decipher that, or begin the decipherment in my historical work. Unlike David Icke, I don't say, who did it, but I do know, like him, that it wasn't the official narrative we're given. And I've actually challenged him to a public debate, in fact, which he's very silently refusing to respond to. Because he's not a historian, he's a kind of conspiracy peddler of theories. War studies and war science is big business. And I think that what 9/11 was about the war business asserting its right to go on. They were afraid that the ending of the Cold War was going to put them out of business. So they had to create new enemies in the Middle East. Islam seemed like the most logical choice. And that would then justify the vast expenditure on war games equipment that, particularly the American, but also the British military and to some extent other ones, French and so on, use. And that's all money that should be spent, as the Poor People's Campaign in America is saying, on social expenditure, as Robert Reich is saying in his critique of military capitalism, because that's essentially what we're dealing with. So we have to oppose that. The trouble is, of course, who dares speak truth in this context? In the Tory party now, anyone that was speaking truth about the follies of Brexit has been thrown out, witch hunted out. In the Republican Party, all the people of integrity have been, silenced. Well, this is because people are only sticking at the level of what I call sociological truths. They're speaking the truth that your tribe, your peer group, want to hear and will permit you to say. There's a level of comfort, like a sort of ozone layer, that this is true. So if you're a Tory party member, yeah, Brexit's good, it's good for us, that's right, let's do it. That's the only truth you're allowed to say now. Because rival voices, nuanced voices, Kenneth Clarke type voices, Rory Stewart type voices, even Philip Hammond type voices, all being chased off the pitch as heretical. That's sociological truth in operation. What we need to do is have the courage intellectually and politically to speak deeper truths, which are psychological, personal, and existential truths. Brexit is an existential assault on everything that I stand for as a person, as a British subject, as a Christian, as a metaphysician, as a European, as an intellectual, as a druid. It assaults all the bases. It's like a sort of corrosive, element, and it's dangerous stuff. That's why I oppose it. But I can only do that, as I've been trying to do with these talks, from a level of existential truth. I have to access a higher truth than the sociologically permitted truth. The more people that speak out, the more people that access those higher levels of consciousness, the better. And then we can remember questioning the ridiculous. For instance, as Bertrand Russell did on the outbreak of World War I. Russell, who was a clever chap, great philosopher, wrote a letter to the Times saying what an absurd folly this was, World War I. I mean, how ridiculous. He was friends with loads of Germans who were studying at Cambridge, some of them his students, like Wittgenstein. Suddenly he had to hate them all. He pointed out that a few weeks before, if he'd have gone off and shot Germans, he would have been arrested as a psychopath and a criminal and hung. Now he's given medals and told to go and do it. No, said Russell, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick to my integrity as an academic, as a philosopher. And for that, he was put in prison for 6 months, just for saying that maybe this war is stupid. Well, we need more people like Russell to come forward. And his friend Einstein, with whom he later launched the Pugwash conference of scientists and religious and philosophical thinkers for peace, opposing the folly of nuclear weapons, because he had the courage, he lived long enough. I was on a peace march with Einstein, with Russell, as a little boy. And, he was an impressive figure even then in the 60s, when he was opposing nuclear weapons. We still have to finish that work. We have to get rid of nuclear weapons. And that's one of the jobs the World Intellectual Forum is pursuing. That's for the new Russells and Einsteins of this generation. Where are the graduates from Oxford and Cambridge and London and Durham and all that? Join us. Let's get involved and finish this work, please. As Kant said, the only thing we need is courage, intellectual courage, that's what Socrates had, it's what Christ had, that's what all philosophers have to have. We can't do our work without courage. And that courage is to speak out at a higher level than the sociological, politically correct, little narrow band of what is, acceptable as truth. We have to actually reach out and find what is the real truth. I'm thinking of Kant as I was watching this dreadful film series called Soviet Storm about the Russian defeat of the Nazi blitzkrieg invasion of Operation Barbarossa, when the Russians totally turned the tide. And I got to the bit where they attacked Königsberg. There were about 100,000 German troops there trying to defend it as the Russian armies were sweeping into Germany. And it was a huge siege. The Russians had vastly powerful guns, pounded it, basically destroyed the town, the city, which is where Kant was from. And I'm very mindful of the tragedy Kant would have thought of that stupid war. He would have personally gone up and stopped Hitler from, launching Barbarossa, and indeed would have stopped him from coming to power, because the man was a ranter with no education and no morality. And all the good people were having to leave Germany. And yet he did it sneakily by pretending to be the real German. That's what these fascist types do. That's like the Farages, I'm the real Brit. I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm the real Brit. Absolute nonsense. It's complete masks of evil and lies. So Königsberg is a great place, and there's a building there, which is where Kant lived. It's his house. I want to turn it into a permanent peace museum. It's in a rundown shape. I'd love to get funding together. If anyone wants to fund a peace museum in Kant's house in Königsberg, which is now part of Russia, it's Kaliningrad, but it's part of European heritage. Let's get the Kant Peace Museum there, which could be a sister one to here, the European Peace Museum here. And we need some people of ethics to come forward with some funding for that. So please, give me a ring. I want to contrast the ignorance of the Brexit lot with Alexander Kojève's work as a great philosopher of Russian origin, knew his Kant inside out, knew his Hegel back to front, upside down, lived from 1902 to 1968, one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century, and he gave a series of lectures here in France, in Paris, on Hegel, which set on fire the intellectual work of the generation of existentialists, the Camus, the Sartre. They all went, and they were just, it was like every generation has to rediscover Hegel, really, who was another great visionary of peace and synthesis and reconciliation of the dialectical opposites that underpin history and that cause us so much turmoil. Enlightenment is the only way out of this predicament. That's what the World Intellectual Forum stands for, and that's what Kojève gave his life for. He ended up working for the European Union. One of the many reasons I love the EU, it's not perfect, but it's better than alternatives, is because Kojève, ended up working for them. He died in Brussels. He's buried right beside the headquarters building. So he's like a philosophical martyr, if you want, for the cause of intellectual reconciliation and unification of Europe in that best Kantian Hegelian tradition, which I think in some small way I'm also coming from. Where are all the others? Where are my philosophical friends? Here's A.C. Grayling. He's probably the other philosopher in British culture that's spoken out most against Brexit, apart from myself. He wrote a wonderful book on war, which most people don't probably know. Grayling runs the College of the Humanities in Russell Square, where I did my degree opposite at the University of London. I feel he's like my brother in arms, and he stands for all that is noble and good in the British intellectual philosophical tradition. But I wish there were more coming out and joining us. And coming to the end, I want to finish with a quote from Mahapragya, who was a great Jain scholar and a friend of mine. And today, the 5th of July, is his thought at sunrise. These are philosophical jottings he wrote at every sunrise over a whole year. It's very interesting, this, and relevant. July the 5th. Some people are straightforward. They are honest in their reporting of events. Some people are very clever at being secretive. To be secretive means many things. One implication is shyness, or to be inhibited. Second implication is deception or misguiding. Third implication is to safeguard secret facts. Fourth implication is not to worry others. Deception is not desirable. Behind the act of safeguarding secrets, there should be discrimination. Secrets may be kept as long as by doing so one does not intensify a problem. Now that's very interesting and worth reflecting on. I've always taken the view that yes, there are secrets in life, and I'm privy to a few. I hold my secrets and confidences like a medical doctor. If people have told me stuff, personal stuff, that's something I've been confided in, that's a secret that I hold in the Hippocratic tradition. But if somebody confides in me something that's horrendous and that is terrible, I think then one has a public duty to speak out. And this is actually the code as a teacher that I've adhered to and that we're trained to. If as a teacher you're told little confidences by the kids and so on, they like you, that's fine, you keep them. But if they tell you stuff that's horrendous, like my dad is a rapist, he keeps abusing me at home, and he's a thief and he keeps stealing money and whatever. If there's criminal stuff going on, then we actually as teachers have a duty to report it to the police or the authorities or the headmaster. Well, that's common sense, right? I think that's what Mahapragya is saying. But above all, he's saying, keep secrets, but not if it intensifies the problem. So, for instance, if I know that one of my children in school is being raped by their father, and I keep quiet about it, and then I hear that he's doing it to other kids, and he's now set up a sort of rape shop, and he's now abducting kids, whatever, something horrendous. Well, no, I have a duty to speak out as soon as possible. That's how I feel about history and secrecy. Now, if, for instance, I was living in 1526 and I was Guicciardini, the great historian chap, and I heard that this invasion was coming, and I was told in secret, well, I would have acted on it. I would have strengthened the defences. I would have tried to get negotiations with Charles V. I would have, done something to prevent the tragedy that was coming onto my city of Rome. And I think that's why I've written my book about 9/11, because what became apparent doing the research for that book is there are an enormous number of layers of secrecy about what happened on 9/11, deliberately being withheld from the American and the world public. Well, that's wrong. That's making it worse, because by not coming clean and admitting and having a proper inquiry and sorting it out at the beginning, then it layers up into the tragedy of the Afghan invasion and chaos, the Iraq invasion and catastrophe, and Syria and the whole kind of meltdown of law and order in the Middle East, deliberately created and manufactured by the original suppression of truth over 9/11. As David Ray Griffin and many others have said over many years of research. So the work has to go on, and the uncovering of the levels of secrecy is part of my job as a transpersonal historian. And as a scholar, that's why I wrote my thesis on the history of the Cold War, because, Stalin operated Russia and got away with it because of secrecy. He manipulated people's fears, he dominated them, and he terrorized them, including his women folk and even his friends. Nobody was safe from Stalin. Hitler did the same. Tyrants always do. As a Democrat, as a liberally minded, socially concerned, green peace activist, I want facts, truth to emerge so that we can be hatched from this egg, if you want, and that we can learn to fly. So I'm going to finish there. I think I've only got one last thing to say, which is that the secrecy that is surrounding the COVID outbreak is another example of what Mahapragya says it's going to cause trouble. If somebody knows what triggered this outbreak, if somebody has done the dark science that caused the coronavirus, then they need to confess, they need to come forward. And that's why I've, argued that we should be actualising the Bioweapons Convention and inspecting the labs, officially at UN level. Because truth should come out. We're all, 500,000 people have died because of this thing, and that's not acceptable. Truth has got to come out. You can't have a diagnosis and a therapy without real truth coming out. So I appeal to any scientists that have an ethical approach to science to get in touch with me, and we'll work on bringing that, that rigour to analyse the outbreak. And, Chris Busby and I can't do it single-handedly, and Eva Zarovnik. So I want to finish with a poem, as I usually do. Only this week it's slightly different. in that I'm going to finish with a poem in prose. As you know, I'm a writer of both poetry and prose. Normally I read a poem at the end of my talks, but today I'm going to read a poem that is in prose. And it's taken from my book of the egg that I've been writing for the last 5 years, on and off. And I think it reads like a poem. So, if you want to set this to music or as a poem, do. It's kind of prose, right? Our deeds have ethical consequences. The laws of karma were formulated and reformulated in 1,000 different tongues and languages. In the Indian religious world, in the Norse runic world, and in the Druidical Celtic world, it was a primary function of the prophetic class to perceive and ascertain the karmic consequences of certain actions by both the individual and the collectivity, and to try to give moral guidance and instruction where possible, or to call for intervention where necessary. This was why the prophetic class in the Semitic world, the Nabi, and the Druid class in the Celtic world, and the Brahminic class in the Hindu world, had moral authority on behalf of the community. Because years of training and study had brought them to the capacity of inner moral vision. It was this perception of the dharmic laws and their shape that was the secret of the Druid's egg, whose dancing was within their gift of knowledge, that put their authority beyond the reach of kings or warlords. The Bible is likewise one long hymn to the perception of justice, to the unfolding of God's justice, whereby events break like waves on the shores of the not yet kingdom of God, where all the inherent goodness and justice of human life will at last be realized. The prophets function in history like so many camel drivers taking a camel caravan of salt across the desert, bringing us safely to our destination, as the Tuaregs still do to this day across the Sahara. There is a lot of talk in esoteric circles of sacred geometry nowadays, and people are fond of finding curious alignments between sacred sites around the landscape, whether around Glastonbury or Rennes-le-Château or the pyramids of Giza or Jerusalem. But perhaps the real sacred geometry we ought to be exploring are the curious alignments between deeds and their consequences, between works of goodness and works of evil. How long does it take to reap what we sow? And what about in bigger political events? For example, why did nobody on his staff or in his inner circle have the moral foresight to point out to Hitler that Operation Barbarossa, which involved breaking a peace pact and embarking on an assault of monstrous hubris and folly, would most likely lead to the final destruction of all his plans for a Third Reich? Did nobody think of warning Steve Bannon and Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings that their monstrous folly of Brexit would likely lead to the break-up of the United Kingdom itself and the re-independence of Scotland and Ireland from English control? History has a way of working itself out over the longue durée. And this is the field I studied for my PhD thesis and developed into the idea of transpersonal history. If we factor spiritual laws and their unfoldment back into our study of history, as Toynbee, Sorokin, Ibn Khaldun, Spengler, Gebser, Aurobindo, Wilbur, Jung, and others all tried to do, we end up with some kind of cyclical evolution of different phases, of cultural high points and nadirs of barbarism and cruelty. End of quotes. That's my poem, which is, something to reflect on. Okay, so shalom. Thank you for listening, and blessed be.